Right, it's been a really long time since I've done a good old-fashioned race review. Like, a really long time. Where I just look at everything that happened across a race weekend and just talk about what happened and my thoughts on it. And with the Qatar Grand Prix being such chaos, I think now's a good time to bring these back. So yeah, I'm just going to go through everything that happened across the Qatar Grand Prix last weekend and give my thoughts on it. So let's get straight into it, and the first person I want to talk about is Maverick Viñales. He was the big story of the Qatar Grand Prix. He had a phenomenal weekend. He did well to qualify on the second row and he was doing really well in the sprint race. However, KTM for some reason decided to put him on the soft tyres, so his tyres fell off a cliff. He scored no points in the sprint race, but come Sunday he looked a completely different rider to what we've seen so far this season. Viñales was phenomenal on Sunday. He was leading for much of the race, crossed the line in second place, and it was one of the best performances we've seen from Viñales in his whole career. Dragging that lawnmower of a KTM up to second was an incredible performance. However, the big story is it's been taken away from him. He got a tyre pressure penalty, which means instead of that second place, he's been classified in 14th spot. It's such a real shame for Maverick Viñales because his performance really deserved that second place, and the fact he doesn't get the reward for it, it's devastating for him, and especially because we know what Viñales can be like. He's very inconsistent, and the fact that KTM is a bit of a lawnmower, I really don't think he'll get another result like that across the whole year, so it's a real shame that's been taken away from him. And once again, it brings up the debate of the tyre pressure rules. I've already made a full video talking about this and how they're switching to Pirelli in a few years, but all I'll say is I can't wait for Pirelli to become the main tyre supplier. The fact that Dorna and Michelin have allowed for there to be a situation where a tyre pressure rule is necessary is just a disgrace, really, and it means that brilliant performances like this are always in jeopardy, and I just really hope it doesn't end up deciding a title or something, because that'd be a huge shame. Like I said, I can't wait for Pirelli to come in. Hopefully they do a much better job than Michelin, and Dorna need to be better at cracking down on the rules and making sure that the tyres are up to scratch. A huge shame for Viñales, but take nothing away from his performance, he was phenomenal. It was probably the best performance of anyone so far this season, and it's just a shame that, in my eyes, I don't think he'll get another one like that across the year. With Qatar being a track he's strong at, we know Viñales is incredibly inconsistent, and that KTM is probably the worst on the grid. I really don't see him getting another result like that, so it's a real shame for him. Next, I want to turn my attention to the two Ducatis, and going into this weekend, I talked about it in my last video, it was very clear that Bagnaia needed to beat Marc Marquez. He's even said it himself, Qatar was the weekend he was looking forward to because he felt like that was the best chance he had at beating Marc Marquez. And it was looking good for Bagnaia. He was matching Marquez's pace on Friday, and it looked like we were in for a really close battle between the two. But then Saturday comes around, Bagnaia crashes in qualifying and starts in 11th place. All of this while Marc Marquez stuck it on pole, and what happened next on the sprint race especially was not really a surprise. Bagnaia struggled massively in the sprint race. He managed to scrape 8th place in the end, 2 points, and if it weren't for the KTM's and Honda's tyres falling off a cliff, he would have finished in about 12th. It was a disastrous sprint race for Bagnaia. However, something we've seen all too often from him. We saw it a few times last season and in previous seasons where he's really struggled in sprint races and he just can't get it together on the Saturday. And especially when you're up against Marc Marquez, you can't afford to have sprint races where you're finishing in 8th place. But like I said, it wasn't surprising in the slightest. We've seen it from Bagnaia in the past, and with Marc Marquez going on to win the sprint race, this was a big blow to Bagnaia's championship challenge. However, on Sunday he seemed to step it up a gear. He did very well to carve through the grid and was even ahead of Marquez by about lap 5, I think. He did very well in the opening laps. However, after that he seemed to really struggle. Marquez and Viñales both went past him, and after that he just didn't seem to have the pace to catch up to those two. The fact that he wasn't able to overtake Viñales on track, he didn't have the pace to even get close to him, was a bit concerning really. And although he did well to get up to the front of the grid in the first place, I feel like once you're there you need to take advantage and try and challenge Marc Marquez, but Bagnaia just didn't have the pace for it, and that's concerning from his side. It really shows that he might just not have the pace this year. The fact that he can't beat Marc Marquez in Qatar is concerning, and I'm really worried for his title hopes after this weekend. Marc Marquez, of course, after struggling a bit in the opening laps, he came home to win very comfortably in the end. And without that crash in USA, he'd be 56 points ahead of Bagnaia in the championship. And he'd have a 46 point gap to his brother in second in the championship. He just seemed to be in a completely different league to everyone else, and it's going to take some stopping from him. Bagnaia, he needs to ruffle up Marquez in Jerez, because otherwise the championship's already done, I think. I mentioned Alex Marquez. He, of course, is still second in the championship, and he had a very eventful weekend. He had a pretty standard Saturday, qualified second, finished second, like he has done in every weekend so far. However, he kind of shat the bed a bit on Sunday. He crashed into Marc Marquez at turn 1 on the first lap. However, that wasn't really exactly his fault, it was the racing incident. However, his crash into Giannantonio a few laps later was his fault. He just completely steamed into him, completely ruined Digi's race, and in the end he recovered to what was 6th place after Viñales' penalty. Decent damage limitation, however, is the first big mistake from Alex Marquez this year, and I do think he was lucky not to get a harsher penalty for his crash with Digi, because he completely ruined Giannantonio's race. Despite that, it was still a good ride for him to recover to 6th place. Overall, he can be happy with his pace over the weekend. However, he needs to cut out any mistakes like that if he is to have a say in this World Championship. It's important that he bounces back in Jerez. However, Jerez is a good track for him in the past, so I think Alex Marquez will be able to recover and return to his usual being in second in every single session. I also want to quickly talk about Franco Morbidelli, because at the start of the year I completely wrote him off. I was saying at the start of the year how I thought he was shit, how I thought he'd be the worst Ducati and he'd be replaced at the end of the year. However, he's been phenomenal this year and he's really proven me wrong. He finished 3rd in the sprint race, the Viñales penalty meant he's got 3rd in the main race, and overall he's shown some really good pace throughout this year. He's been ahead of Giannantonio in most sessions. He's shown a lot of pace, a lot of aggression in his battling, which is really great to see, because for nearly 4 years it seemed like the Morbidelli of old was gone through injuries, but he seems to have regained all his confidence and is back, and I'll happily be wrong about this, because it's great to see Frankie back at the top of the grid. His teammate Giannantonio I thought was really unlucky in this race. He had good pace in the sprint race, and I'll be honest, I thought in the Sunday race he'd have the pace to challenge for victory. However, he of course had his race ruined by Alex Marquez, and with damage to his bike he was just never able to recover. Really unfortunate. However, Digi can still be happy with his pace across the weekend, and he's shown that there will be races this season where he is fighting for victories. And the other Ducati man, Fermin Aldeguer, he had a very impressive weekend. After showing a lot of pace in USA but then unfortunately crashing out near the end, he backed that pace up and had a very solid weekend. 4th in the sprint race, 5th in Sunday. He had a very good weekend and he is proving his worth on the MotoGP grid. He's showing a lot of aggression in his overtakes. He's not afraid of anybody. He's showing a lot of promise for me now to get, and I'm glad about that, because I feel like there would have been some people who wrote him off before he even got on the bike. He's proving any doubters he had after last year completely wrong. He deserves his spot on the MotoGP grid and he's showing that so far. He's done very well, I think. Now, after the Ducatis, it is absolute chaos among the rest of the grid. If we look at the Constructors' Championships, after Ducati, the other 4 manufacturers are separated by just 7 points. It is extremely tight. However, the first one I want to talk about is Honda, and specifically Johann Zarco, because he's been by far the best of the Hondas. Honda have really stepped it up this year. They're showing a lot more pace than last year, and Johann Zarco is the one who's getting the best results out of that bike. He got a 3rd place in the sprint race in Argentina, which was super impressive. 4th place in this race as well. He has been by far the best Honda. Joan Mir has also shown similar pace, however, he was ill this weekend and he's also just been crashing a lot more than Zarco. However, Honda really stepped it up. Zarco's continuing his form from last year, and it's really good to see Honda being competitive again. And we can somewhat say the same about Yamaha, because Quartararo this weekend got his first front row start in, I think, 3 years, the first since Assen 2022. Brilliant qualifying from him. However, he seems to be the only one of the Yamahas who seems to be somewhat competitive, which tells me there's mostly Quartararo just being world class rather than the bike having that much improvement from last year. We've seen that when Jack Miller is on it, he can get a good result out of the bike. However, I still don't think that the Yamaha is that much better than last year. It's clear they've made steps in terms of qualifying pace. However, as a race bike, the Yamaha is nothing special, I think, shown by the fact that Quartararo finished 7th in the end in the main race and 5th in the sprint race. And it was very clear that Yamaha was suffering in the straight line, something they've always been struggling with. They still haven't fixed that. Still a good weekend for Quartararo though, but it shows that Yamaha still have some steps to make if they are to be really competitive. Next I want to talk about KTM. Of course, I've already talked about Viñales and his freakish weekend. However, aside from that, KTM seemed to be in a real sticky situation. Pedro Acosta was the highest classified KTM after Viñales' penalty, getting 8th place, and he has been the fastest of the KTM so far this season. However, because the bike isn't very good, he is, like last season, pushing the bike to its limit and more than often than not crashing. This tactic does seem to be working for him though, because he is the KTM rider with the most points in the championship. However, KTM, I think they're in real hot bother. Their bike does not seem to be competitive at all. I really think they're being carried by the fact that they have one of the strongest lineups, if not the strongest lineups on the grid. They have some of the best riders on the grid and they're really wasting them with a below par bike. It's clear they've made no steps from last year. If anything, they've gone backwards with everyone else improving. And yeah, KTM are in real hot bother, and there's a lot of rumours about Acosta leaving them for next year. I'll make a full video about this, but there's a rumour of Honda being offered 10 million a year to go to Honda. And I'll be honest, if I was Acosta, I'd be taking that move in a heartbeat right now, because KTM seem absolutely nowhere, and they're showing very little signs of improvement. I mean, just look, Brad Binder, who got 2nd in both races here last year, he finished 13th in this race. Bastianini, who has won here in the past, he got 11th place. Both these riders qualified well down the grid. It was a shocking weekend from KTM at a track which they theoretically should be quite good at. Yeah, it's not looking good for KTM and they need to get a grip, seriously. And finally, we need to mention Aprilia. They've had a disastrous start to the year. Ayagura has been the only shining light of this season so far, and even he struggled this weekend. He did well in the sprint race, getting 7th place, however 15th place on Sunday is just not as good as he has been across the whole season. However, considering he's a rookie, a race like this is sort of expected from him. He's not going to be amazing in every race. A race like this where he finishes in 15th place is sort of expected really, and there's no shame in it. It just proves that he might not be quite on the level of someone like Quartararo or Acosta when they were rookies. He still had a phenomenal start to the season though, and he has been the only shining light of Aprilia's season. Because while he may be ahead of Agura in the standings, Marco Bezzecchi has still had an embarrassing start to the year. The fact that it's even close between him and Agura so far this season is shameful from his side. He should be battering Agura, he should be fighting for podiums. However, he just can't seem to get the use of that bike at all. He's been completely outpaced by Agura on most occasions. Bezzecchi seriously needs to get a grip, because he's been pretty embarrassing so far this season. And we could say the exact same about Ralph Fernandez being battered by Ayagura, even in this race. I mean, 5 points for Ralph Fernandez all year is pretty shocking so far, and if he doesn't improve in the next few races, he won't be getting a contract after his current one, let's just say that. However, the big story out of Aprilia this weekend was Jorge Martin. He was making his return this weekend after sitting out the first 3 races after injuries, and for the most part he was doing fantastically. He was being competitive with Bezzecchi, which probably says more about Bezzecchi more than Martin, and he was ahead of Bagnaia at one point in his sprint race. However, Jorge Martin suffered a really nasty crash and he's gone injured again because of it. From what it seems like, he has suffered from a collapsed lung and 11 broken ribs. It's devastating for Jorge Martin and seriously unlucky. Especially because you could tell from his race position that he wasn't exactly pushing really hard and risking everything. He was being careful and it was just an unfortunate crash, and it was one that could have ended so much worse because he had a crash right in front of Giannantonio and Digi ended up hitting him on the back with his bike. There was no way he could have avoided it, and to be honest, I think Jorge Martin, while it's unlucky he's got the injuries again, he's lucky to be able to walk away from that crash because it could have ended so much worse. The replays have shown just how close it was to being a devastating crash for Martin, one that we could have lost Jorge Martin. So I think while it's seriously unlucky he's got injured again, I do think we are seriously lucky not to have lost Jorge Martin this weekend because that crash could have ended so badly. However, it seems like Jorge Martin's going to be out for a while. The reports are saying that he'll be stuck in Qatar for the next 3 weeks while he recovers from his injuries, and he probably won't be on the MotoGP grid again in at least 3 months. And it's really unfortunate for Martin's side because we want to see him on that Aprilia and we want to see what the world champion can do, and we just aren't being able to see that because of the constant injuries. I really hope he's able to make a swift and effective recovery and return towards the back end of the year to get full fitness for 2026, because this year's a write-off for Jorge Martin now. He needs to focus on being fully back to full fitness by the time he recovers. But that's about everything I wanted to talk about in MotoGP, so now let's look at the other classes, starting with Moto2. This was a banging race in Moto2. They were all amazing races. Every race this weekend was amazing. However, Moto2 especially was a great one. This race was won by Aaron Canet after he had a disastrous start. He was 11th, I believe, after the first lap. He carved his way through the field brilliantly and claimed home a very good victory. His first victory of the year, and one which really proves that he is in the title race, and he showed why he's the favourite for the title going into this year. He was a step above the rest this weekend and fully deserved the victory. He was phenomenal. However, I want to mention Deniz Oncu in second. He led for most of this race and he has shown real progression across his career. Because there was one point in his career where he looked like he had talent, however, he just seemed to be too crashy. He seemed like he would never make that step and mature enough. However, this race showed how much Deniz Oncu has matured over his career. He showed a lot of progression from his Moto2 days where he seemed really erratic. Yeah, he was unlucky not to win this one, however, it was still a brilliant performance from Oncu, and one that shows that maybe not this year, but next year he could be a serious contender for the Moto2 title. Just behind him in third was Manu Gonzalez. A decent result for him, one which he'll definitely take after his disastrous result in the USA. However, he might be slightly frustrated he only got third after being on pole on Saturday. However, it's still a good result, one that keeps him very much within title contention, especially after Jake Dixon's crash. Speaking of, like I said, Jake Dixon had a crash in this race. He crashed out of 5th position, and it's his first big mistake of the year, the first big mistake of any of the main title contenders, I think. And it was an unfortunate crash, however. This is a sort of race where if you can't have the pace to win, you need to be able to accept a 5th or 6th place, which Jake should have done. I was thinking to myself before he crashed, he's going to crash at this rate because he looked really sketchy on that bike and he paid the price for it. He was clearly pushing too hard. And it's really unlucky for him after 2 straight victories. He surrendered the championship lead and, I don't know, is this sort of mistake which he can't afford to have too many of if he wants to win this World Championship. It's still been a very good start to the season for Jake Dixon though, much better than last year, and he is still very much within title contention. However, aside from them, in 4th place we had Dani Holgado. And I need to talk about him because in my video I made in January, I believe, where I talked about all the Moto3 rookies coming up to Moto2, I pinpointed Holgado as the main one who I thought would struggle, and he has really shut me up because he's been by far the best of all the rookies coming up to Moto2. He has been brilliant so far this season. He currently sits 4th in the championship, which is unbelievable. An 8th, 9th, 8th and a 4th place finish so far is really good from Holgado. He's been by far the most impressive of the rookies, and I thought he'd be getting battered by his teammate David Alonso, but it's been the complete opposite way around. Fair play to Holgado, he's really proved me wrong as he's shown so much potential so far this season. He was unlucky not to get a podium in this race, but if he keeps performing like he has done, he'll be getting on the podium very soon. However, his teammate David Alonso had a good weekend in himself. Qualified in 11th, but then had a shocking start, getting really beaten up in some battles. However, he recovered brilliantly to get an 11th place finish, his best result of the year, and after struggling initially through injuries, David Alonso has really shown his talent across the past few races, and he's showing that he will adapt to Moto2 eventually. He's just taking a bit longer than maybe Holgado is. However, David Alonso, he's showing his talent, he's showing improvement in every race. And I think that around the halfway point he will be fighting around the top end of the grid, like we thought he would be. The final person I want to mention in Moto2 is Celestino Vietti. He had a fairly underwhelming weekend. He seemed to struggle a lot for pace. All the Boscos seemed to struggle for pace this weekend. However, he got a good damage limitation result in 7th. And I never uploaded the video in the end because I just edited it too late. However, I made some championship predictions for Moto2 and Moto3, and I pinpointed Vietti to be my winner for the championship. And so far, he's had the pace to be a championship contender. However, he's not really got the results. He was crashed out of Thailand, that wasn't his fault. However, he then crashed out of USA, which was his fault. And without those two crashes, he'd be well within championship contention. However, he has made those mistakes, and he currently sits 10th in the championship, 46 points behind Aaron Canet in first. I think my prediction might be aging slightly poorly here. However, he's shown good pace so far this season, and if he can get some consistency going, I still think he could be a championship contender. He might not win it though, because a 46 point gap already is going to be a lot to claw back. He's shown some good pace this season, and at the end of the day, 7th place is a good damage limitation result at a track he clearly isn't that good at, and the Boscoscuro just didn't seem to work at. But yeah, with that, the Moto2 championship currently looks like this. Aaron Canet's on 71 points, Manu Gonzalez is 10 points behind on 61, with Jake Dixon on 59. It's very close at the top of the Moto2 championship, and like I said, I do think come around the halfway stage, Vietti will be up with those three. Apart from that, it's a complete mess, and no one else has got the consistency to be a title contender. However, I think we're in for a very exciting Moto2 championship this season. There could be a real all-time classic battle between those four for the championship. And finally, the Moto3 race. This was an absolute classic. Qatar always delivers amazing Moto3 races. It's probably the best track for Moto3. And it delivered again, shown by the fact that the top 4 in this race were covered by less than a tenth of a second crossing the finish line. The battle between the top 5 for victory was amazing, and yeah, it was just complete chaos, which is what I love in Moto3. In the end, it was Angel Piqueras who came out on top, 9 thousandths ahead of Tayo Furusato. And Piqueras has shown so far this season that he is very good in a last lap battle. He showed it in Argentina, he showed it last season in Misano when he got his brilliant first victory, and he's shown it again here in Qatar. In Moto3, I think the most important skill is being able to win a last lap battle, and Angel Piqueras I think is the best at that in the whole grid, and that is going to come crucial in his title battle. He currently sits 2 points ahead of Jose Antonio Rueda in the championship. Rueda himself wasn't able to be in the last lap battle because his bike blew up with a lap to go. However, Piqueras does seem to be a lot better in a last lap battle than Rueda does. Rueda seems to be very good at pulling a gap at the front and dominating races. However, when it comes to a scrap, I don't think anybody is better than Piqueras in the entire grid. I do think it's going to come between those two for the championship. I don't see anyone else having the consistency to be in a championship battle, but if Piqueras is going to be this good in a last lap battle, I've struggled to see a way he doesn't win the championship, unless Rueda dominates so many races across the year, which, I'll be honest, considering it's Moto3, I don't think that will happen. Rueda was seriously unlucky with this one though. He was in the battle to fight for victory, and he could have proved me wrong. However, his bike just gave up on him with a lap to go, which is really unfortunate. Tayo Furusato was the man who just missed out on victory in the end, and it was a good result for him. However, he'll be devastated not to win, and at the same time, I do still think that he hasn't got the consistency to be a consistent title contender. Like before this, he finished 9th in America. You're not going to win races if you're finishing in 9th, and it wasn't from a crash or anything. That was just his pace that weekend. If Furusato is able to get some consistency going, he could be a title contender. However, this season seems to be a continuation of last season for Furusato, and he just doesn't seem to have the consistency to fight for the title. And we can say the exact same about Ryusa Yamanaka. A good weekend for him. He got his first pole position and had a real good go at trying to get that victory. However, he just came short, and like Furusato, he's clearly got talent and pace. However, he's just not got the consistency to be a serious title contender. However, one person who does have the pace to be a title contender but consistently lets everyone down is Joel Kelso. He clearly has the pace to contend for the title this year. However, he just isn't good enough at battling. It happens in every race. It happened last season, probably even the year before. He has good qualifying, he starts well, he's in the hunt for victory. However, he gets shuffled to the back and doesn't throw a move on anybody. Just sits to the back and waiting for other people to mess each other up. And it's this reason why he's not won a race yet in Moto3. And it's the reason why I don't think he'll be a title contender again this year. He needs to show more aggression in the last lap battles, because that is what is the main component for success in Moto3 is showing aggression, and Joel Kelso seems to have none of that. It's really frustrating from his side because he clearly has the pace to be a title contender at least, and he's just not taking advantage of it. 4th place again in this race, and if he threw a move on someone, who knows where he could have finished, because it was absolute chaos in the last lap, but he just sat back and forth watching everything unfold in front of him. It's like he's too scared to go for a move, and you just can't be too scared to go for a move in Moto3, otherwise you won't succeed at all. But that is everything that I wanted to talk about from this weekend in Qatar. So now I want to know what you guys think. What did you think of the Qatar Grand Prix? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel while you're there. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye bye.